And he was explaining to me that he'd done 26 years in prison, not all of them because it one stretch, but because you're a life prisoner you get released, but if you commit an offence you get pulled back in. And Harry was telling me that he had problems when he got out because he didn't know, he'd gone out of prison at 16, and he'd obviously come from a very difficult background where parents were dysfunctional. He didn't know how to carry out a phone conversation. And we all sat and say, that can't be right, how's that? But if you've never been told, you just pick up a phone and you go, well, you speak to the council to get a council house. He doesn't go, excuse me, you know, I'm phoning about him. He tends to go, you know, usually with some swear words, to which the person at the other end of the phone probably just goes, like that. So and I have to say, when I met him, it was actually quite humbling because he was living in a wee flat in Postle Park, which I wouldn't necessarily view as a desirable area. It's a very challenging area, there's very good people in Postle Park, but it's not an area I would, you know, I'm happy up where I am in Meadowbank. But he was happy. And he had also managed to get furniture, because he said he'd come out before, he couldn't get furniture. And of course, you then get involved in crime and back in you go. So we've got to deal with the individuals, because the ones that are on the revolving door will invariably have alcohol, drug, and mental health, sometimes all three, and they'll usually have, you know, the lack of accommodation, lack of support, and the lack of something to do. Harry got it sorted out, we got him a council house, we got him furniture. Actually, probably wasn't ever going to be gainful employment, but he was working in the garden in the church in Postle Park. That gave him some purpose in life. So it's giving people that support, those three things.
Thank you. Yeah. What do you think of the rehabilitation programmes that are used in prisons?
I think prisons try, and I think they do a good job. At the end of the day, when somebody comes out, you've got to be able to continue. So I think there's probably three things to say. One is prison is difficult. Prison authorities do what they can, but first job of prison is to make sure people don't get out and they're kept secure, because they are prisoners, and we also have to make sure the community is safe from them, although many wouldn't harm again. It's not you know, built as a purpose-built school or college. It's not built as a purpose-built, you know, hospital. It's not built as a purpose-built gymnasium, and yet it's got to be able to do all these things. It would be like saying, this library has to do everything that Portobello High School does. Everything. Science, gym, it's all got to be done in here. Because that's to some extent what prison has to do. You've got an environment and you've got to deal with everything. You know, if somebody's seriously ill, they go to hospital, but if they're sick, they get treated there. If they're going to get educated, they get treated there. You've got people who have university degrees in prison. You've got people who can't read and write in some shape or form, and you've got to deal with them all. So there's first of all challenges, and we've got to get some realism. So prison does a good job and tries, and does what it best for the individual, but it can never replicate what you would do if you were, you know, at a university, at a college, at work, or whatever. So that's the first challenge they face. The second challenge is you've got to make sure that they're, you know, we can talk the talk, but they've got to walk the walk, they've got to be up for it. Sometimes they're not, sometimes there's peer pressure. You've got to be able to analyse what the issue is. Dyslexia, for example, is a huge problem in prison. I'm grateful to Jackie Stewart for all the support there. The third thing is they've got to get out, you've got to make sure that it links, because there's no point having people on a drug rehab programme if the moment they get out, they can't continue it, and they then fall back into the bad company and they get back onto drugs or they're off alcohol. The first thing they do is go to the pub that they used to go to. So it's making sure when they leave, and it comes back to the point made by a colleague earlier, it's to stop that revolving door. You've really got to make sure that when they leave, they've got a place to go, they've got somebody to support them, preferably family, but some support and something to do. And fourthly, if they're on any treatment, then that continues. We can't have, as I said, people coming out, not having access to benefits, coming out, they've got an addiction, and yet they can't get a prescription because it needs signed by the doctor, and they can't get a doctor because they've been in prison for 3 years, so they've got to make an arrangement to see the doctor. The doctor says, well, you can come in next, you know, Wednesday or Friday. It says, well, I need a prescription now because I've got an addiction, and it's, well, I'm not signing a prescription because you're not my patient, I'm not making you my patient till I see you. So it's breaking down those barriers. But, you know, we can get there, it can be done. Yeah.
Does bad parenting and poverty affect children, and how?
Well, I think poverty does affect parents. We'll deal with both, because I think both. Poverty does have links. Equally, I think what we've always got to point out is the overwhelming majority of poor people do not commit a crime, would would never dream of committing a crime are law-abiding and honest. That said, it's not rocket science to work out that people who are offending are proportionally more likely to come from areas that are poor. That's not because people in wealthy areas are better. It's just poverty puts pressure upon people to act in different ways. And I always remember the statistics. We now have multi-member wards in Scotland, but there was a friend of mine who had been the governor of Barlinnie in Glasgow, who one night decided to do a survey. And at that stage in Scotland, we had 1,000, I remember this, vaguely remember the stats, 1,222 council wards in Scotland. You know, because you've had Portobello, Craigmillar, 1,222 council wards, and on one night, there were few. The majority of areas in Scotland did not have anybody in prison. You know, 25% of the population in prison on that one night, and that was just a snapshot, but it would, you could do it tonight and you'd get exactly the same. 25% came from, I think, it was something like 55 of the 1,222 wards. And of that 55, you could break it down. Something like 55 were in Glasgow, 12 were in Edinburgh, 3 or so were in Dundee, some were in Aberdeen, one was in South Lanarkshire, it was clearly Gauntfrapple and the Motherwell area, one was in Renfrewshire, it was Ferguson Park and Paisley. In Edinburgh, it wasn't Meadowbank or Duddingston, it was going to be Craigmillar, Hilton, Muirhouse. So there's a correlation there, that people who are in difficulties, who are devoid of hope, you know, who don't have access to matters, are matters there. That's why law enforcement can't address all things. It has to be dealt with by social and economic changes, education and health. Bad parenting, yes, if you grow up in, doesn't mean you're required to, it doesn't mean that you will, because many people from this, parents with difficulties with drug or alcohol and problems will not end up that way, but my experience, and I'm sure they're replicated by all the teachers here, behind every troubled child, there's usually some issue at home. You know, mum's got a heroin problem, dad's on the drink or whatever. There are issues there, and therefore that affects the child and the way some people live out. We were talking earlier to Jenny there about the movie The Angel Share. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but the boy Paul Brannigan, he was actually in River City recently. I know how Paul grew up. Paul basically grew up, he never liked to grow around with the word feral, but he had to bring up, when he was young, your age and younger, bring up his younger brother because his mum was a heroin addict and his dad was just away. These things, it wasn't surprising that Paul got into trouble. To his eternal credit, he's straightened himself out, and you know, he shows that there is, everybody's got the possibility of redemption. So yes, bad parenting is a huge, I mean, if you grow up in a dysfunctional family, it's very, very difficult, and you're bound to react. And equally, poverty doesn't cause crime, but it does create circumstances where people will end up heading in that direction. And that's why some situations can only be dealt with by a police officer, by law enforcement. Other situations to make Scotland safer, just like tackling alcohol abuse, it's about creating a fairer, more equal society, it's about providing access and opportunities, and it's about giving hope